This video provides a tour of the ArcGIS desktop user interface, particularly the user interface of ArcMap, which is the most popular mapping software product available within the ArcGIS desktop suite. Loading ArcGIS when you have it installed on your computer is a very simple process. We begin by navigating to the Start menu, and then once you're in the Start menu, open up the ArcGIS folder. If it is your first time launching ArcGIS, you might be surprised by the number of applications and tools that are contained within the ArcGIS folder. ArcGIS Desktop, or ArcGIS put more simply, is not just one application. It is in fact a suite of applications, each of which provides some core functionality to the overall platform. Many of the most common applications are installed when you install ArcGIS Desktop using your student license. Of all of the applications contained within this folder, the one that you will far and away use the most frequently is ArcMap. And when we say ArcGIS in this class, we are typically referring to the functionality provided by ArcMap. Many of the other applications contained here, however, are very useful. They're just not used quite as frequently for common desktop GIS mapping purposes. ArcCatalog, for example, is useful for organizing and managing your data. ArcGlobe is useful for visualizing data on a three-dimensional globe surface, and ArcScene is useful for creating customized three-dimensional mapping products. ArcMap, however, is the application that we will be using far and away the most in this course. And as such, before you even launch ArcMap, I recommend making shortcuts to it both within your Start menu and on your taskbar down below. Creating these shortcuts is relatively simple. To pin ArcMap to your Start menu, simply right-click on ArcMap in the Start menu and choose Pin to Start. And you can see that a link to it is then created. You can also drag ArcMap down to the taskbar. And then anytime you want to launch ArcMap, it's as simple as clicking down here in the taskbar, and the application will open. Anytime you launch ArcMap, there is a loading process involved. Depending on the speed of your computer, this may even take a couple of minutes. And there we have it. When ArcMap loads for the first time, you will see the option to create a blank map document or to choose from any number of templates that are provided. For the purpose of this demonstration, we will continue forward by just creating a blank map. Before proceeding, though, I would like to point out that I would encourage you to always exercise patience when loading ArcMap. If at any point in time you find that the loading process is taking a while, I suggest refraining from clicking on the ArcMap icon or trying to launch the application more than once, as doing so will simply open up another instance of ArcMap, which will invariably slow down the launching of the first process. And likewise, a separate instance is launched every time you click on the icon if it is not running already, so I suggest being mindful of that. From this Getting Started window, we will simply click on OK to proceed to the primary ArcGIS interface. By default, your window should look something like this. There may be other panels or pages on the screen open upon initial launch, but the default user interface does look something like this. At its most basic level, you have several components to the ArcMap user interface. You have a series of menu bars that provide some functionality. You have a series of toolbars, and these toolbars provide direct access to some tools that allow for the modification of the visual parameters and the map extent of the current view of any data that you might have loaded, as well as some tools that control your ability to work with some components of your document. You can, for example, create a new file, open a file, save a file, or print a file from this menu. And from this button here, which looks like a plus sign with a sheet of paper beneath it, you can add data to your map using this tool here in the toolbar as well. Typically, though, anything that you can do from within the toolbar, you can also do from some sort of menu or other place within the ArcGIS user interface. This large white portion here of the screen, the largest uninterrupted component of the screen, is what's called the data view. The data view is where you will see the geography or see the features or data layers that are loaded when you load data from any sort of geographic data source on your computer or from a remote server. The data will all be rendered in map form, and you can interact with the features through that interface or through other interfaces that we will discuss later. The data that are shown in the data view are also listed in a panel called the Table of Contents. The table of contents is by default listed here on the left-hand side of the screen, though you can move that around, and you can also turn it off if you ever want to view the contents of your data frame with a larger view. In this table of contents, you would see the ordered list of all of the data layers that are included within your document. Think of GIS as a layered cake. Every time you add a data layer, it is rendered in sequence with all of the other data layers that are provided in the document. The data layers that are rendered on top and listed on top in the table of contents will appear to be visually on top of those that are beneath it in the table of contents. And you can, at your convenience and as desired, reorder or manipulate parameters of any of the layers directly from the table of contents. And therefore, this is one of the most important parts of the ArcMap user interface. There is also a series of tabs here on the left side of the screen. One showing a catalog of data, and another allowing you to search through the document for any information or any tools that you might want. This could include map layers, data, or tools that are available within an interface called the Toolbox. But we'll cover many of those things in later weeks. For now, though, let's cover some practices associated with loading data into an ArcMap document. Let's close the search box before we move forward, and then move toward loading some data. In ArcMap, there is a very straightforward tool that can be used to load all kinds of geospatial data into your document, and it is called the Add Data tool. It is available right here within the toolbar. The icon looks like a layer icon with a plus on top of it, and you can also get to it from the File menu, where you can choose Add Data and then Add Data. The Add Data window then appears, and you should be able to see that it clearly resembles a lot of other file opening and saving dialog boxes that you've seen in other applications. One important distinction, however, is that within the Add Data tool, there is no standard interface for navigating the file system on your computer. There is a link to a home folder which contains a geodatabase, that's what this file is called, and a toolbox. But otherwise, there is no link pointing directly to your C drive or to any other drives or folders here on your local computer. This is by design in ArcMap. In order to access files on your computer's drive, you have to establish what is called a folder connection. And a folder connection is simply a link to any given folder on your computer where you will be doing work. This can be a little bit frustrating at times because, as you can imagine, it makes it harder to as quickly open up files that are stored from throughout your computer's file system. But the advantage is that it keeps your work a little bit cleaner and confined to one or more directories. So if we click on folder connections, at first we'll see nothing. And that's by design. We will need to add some folder connections before proceeding. Let's first take a look at some geographic data. So I have stored here on my computer a set of data that we will be working with in this demonstration. It's the same data that you will be using for an assignment, and it is contained here within a folder on the desktop called Workspace. I have set up this folder called Workspace as a general destination for storing some data that we'll be working with in ArcMap, and therefore we can create a folder connection to this Workspace folder and then work entirely out of that folder. Within this folder, we have several things. We have a compressed file, so we have a zip file, and then we also have a folder that is the unzipped version of that zip file. Note that if we didn't have this for any reason, we could very easily unzip this with the application 7-zip just by right-clicking, choosing 7-zip, and then choosing Extract. And then if we open that up, inside of that you can see we have several other folders, and these other folders contain geographic data. We have data layers here for capital cities, the boundaries of countries, populated places, rivers, roads, and urban areas. If we open up these folders, you'll see that the structure of each of these folders looks relatively similar in terms of the number and the type of files that we have contained within them. The files that are contained within these folders are called shapefiles, and shapefiles are used for storing data that are encoded in vector form. There are two primary types of data that we use in ArcGIS. Raster data, which are used to represent continuous variables, or variables that can be observed at any point on the surface of the Earth or within a study area, and vector data. Vector data encodes discrete features, or features that have a defined location and a bounded location, such that we can represent them with one of three different types of two-dimensional geometric primitives: points, lines, or polygons. So these shapefiles contain either point, line, or polygon geometry, and these other files support the shapefile and are considered a part of the shapefile as well. Other videos will go into greater detail about the structure of the shapefile format, but it is very important to note that the shapefile format requires that all of these files that are stored with the shapefile be preserved in the same directory as the core shapefile, which has the extension of .shp. So you never want to separate the shapefile's components. It's very important that they be preserved in the same directory. And so when preparing data for this assignment, we made sure to separate every shapefile into its own folder. That is a commonly regarded best practice for data management that can often help keep your work much more organized. Enough said on that front. Let's go back into ArcMap and establish our first folder connection. From the Add Data window, simply click Connect to Folder. Then we have the opportunity to navigate to where our files are stored. And I have this here in my desktop. And we have this folder, Workspace. Once we have made the folder connection, you'll see that the folder connection will appear underneath the Folder Connections menu. We can then get back to that at any time. If you are logging in to Windows and ArcMap via some sort of virtualization setting, you might find that it is a file path that is preceded by 2 backslashes. If you're using a native Windows PC, you will probably see the prefix C:\\, or some other letter corresponding to the designation of the drive that you are using. However, once we are within this interface, we can then navigate to our folders and we can add a data layer. So let's navigate to our countries boundaries. You'll note here that we have 2 options for files that can be loaded. One is a text file. We don't necessarily want to load that. Then the other is our .shp file, or shapefile. This country's shapefile contains the boundaries of countries encoded as polygons. To add this to the document, we will simply choose Add. Then in just a moment, voila, we now have our first map being rendered in ArcMap, and we can see all of the country boundaries contained within this dataset being rendered on our screen. If we hover over the map, you can see that at the lower right-hand corner of the screen, we have some coordinates being displayed. Those coordinates are longitude and latitude, respectively. Why longitude first, when we typically would say latitude and longitude and express them in that order? Well, within a GIS, we typically express the x-coordinate first and then the y-coordinate second. Longitude tells us how far east or west we are, which is horizontal, and latitude tells us how far north or south we are, which is vertical. So in that case, we would express our latitude first, and if we hover here over Southern California, you can see that the latitude and longitude values are exactly what we would expect them to be. Now we can dive a little more into exploring this data with the user interface. Note that the most important tools for manipulating the parameters of the map, the visual parameters of the map, are these 4 right here: zoom in, zoom out, pan, and full extent. Pan, which is the tool selected by default, lets us move our map view around. Zoom in lets us either click to zoom in on the map or draw a box to zoom in on the map. Zoom out does the same thing. If we ever find that we've gone too far off course, we can just hit this button here, full extent, to load the full extent of all of the geographic data layers included within the map. You can also zoom to any individual layer by right-clicking on the layer in the table of contents and choose Zoom to Layer. This brings up another very important point. We now have a layer added to our table of contents. Right now it's just one layer, but it is a layer nonetheless. Currently this view here, List by Source, shows us which folder each layer is contained within. But if we wanted to make things easier and list by drawing order, we could choose that, and then we have only this one entry here in our list of the table of contents. We can see the icon or the symbol that is being used to represent this layer, as well as the name of the file. There are several other very useful tools present here within the ArcMap interface. One is Identify. Identify allows us to click on any feature and learn a little bit about it. If we were to click on Canada, for example, we would see a little information here. Note that when we click on Canada, it is highlighted briefly, and then information about that feature shows up. This gets to the core of working with vector data in a GIS. Vector data in a GIS contain two core components: the geometry of the features and then the attributes of the features. The values that we see here, whether text, numbers, or any other type of attribute data, are called the attributes because they are stored in individual fields that describe the feature that we clicked on. Every feature within this dataset has the same attribute fields associated with it. We can see this in greater detail if we right-click on the layer and choose Open Attribute Table. As you can see here, now instead of seeing the features for just one of the features included here in the dataset, we now see the attributes for all of the features included in the dataset. Of course, in order to see them all at one time, we would have to scroll a little bit. But you can see that every feature or every country within this dataset corresponds to exactly one row. Every column corresponds to one attribute. And because every feature has one row, we can see that every row or every country has the same attribute fields associated with it. But of course, the values can differ depending on which feature we are looking at. You can highlight features on the map just by clicking on the attribute table, just as we highlighted features on the map and saw the attributes using the Identify tool. So if we wanted to highlight this feature here corresponding to Mexico, we could just click on the far left side of this attribute table row, and you could see that Mexico would be highlighted. We could do this with any other country present within the dataset as well. We can also view the properties of this layer at any time by opening up Properties from right-clicking on the layer. This window is the gateway to many of the different operations that we can perform upon the layer. It's where we can customize the visual appearance of the features, as well as change some of the other properties of the layer as well. We will get into the specifics of working with this at a later time. Note that this view here that we are seeing is called the Data View. There is also a Layout View, and if you click on this, we will see that the map is now being confined to a page layout. This is a completely separate topic that we will cover in a different screencast, but do note that if you ever find yourself inadvertently viewing a page instead of viewing the data only, you can always revert just to looking at the data by toggling between the Layout View and the Data View.